You know, my friends, I've had a lot of my colleagues ask me, Frank, why do you get so excited about these issues? Why do you get so stirred up? You're usually a pretty calm, laid-back fella. Well, let me tell you, I come from a part of the country that was the abyss of the Great Depression and the drought of the 1930s. Some of you may have seen Mr. Burns' documentary about the Dust Bowl. Those are my constituents. Those were my relatives in Roger Mills County as well as the Panhandle. I was raised by a generation, my grandparents, who were young men and women during the Great Depression, who lived through that drought. They were scarred forever. My maternal grandfather co-signed my first farm lease, co-signed my note at the bank so that I could start farming. But he was convinced till the day he died, just as my other grandfather was, the Great Depression was coming back. It was coming back. Now, my parents were young men and women in the 50s, and they went through the drought of the 50s, far worse than the drought of the 30s. To the day he died, my father was convinced that it would never rain again. And I came home from college in 1982 just in time to observe the collapse in agricultural land prices. I was raised by the generation that suffered through the 30s and the 50s. I came home to watch the Vietnam generation be destroyed by things beyond farmers, be destroyed by things beyond their control in the early 1980s. That's why I get so worked up on this policy. The misery of the 30s, the misery of the 80s, economically was not an accident. It was policy mistakes in the 20s and 30s that led to that agony. It was policy mistakes in the 70s and 80s that led to that agony. Now you say, Frank, you're excited, you're getting worked up. Look at the 1930 census for Roger Mills County. There were 14,000 people living in my home county. By the 1940 census, there were 7,000 people living in my home county. And we've just now made it back to the mid-3000s. You don't have that kind of economic devastation, depopulation, suffering by accident. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm working with my colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Peterson. That's why I've worked with Republicans, Democrats alike, for years now to get to this point. That's why I want to work with all of you. I cannot make it rain. There may be people in this town who say they can make it rain, but I cannot make it rain. But in my tenure as chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, I can make sure we pass a comprehensive farm bill that does not repeat the mistakes of the 1920s and 30s, does not repeat the mistakes of the 1970s and 80s. I will not be a part of inflicting on future generations what was inflicted on what I call that generation of Vietnam veterans who came home to farm and instead went to the bankruptcy auctions. Or my grandparents' generation, whose young men and women were wiped out in the 1930s. I will not be a part of that. So I will work with all of you to try and improve this draft that attempts to produce a safety net that is workable, that is efficient, both for rural America and producers, but also for consumers. I ask you to work with me in that regard. I ask you to do the right thing. I ask you to avoid the mistakes of the past. I ask you to look at the language, to study the language, and be good, responsible legislators. Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from